Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Rise and Fall of the East, How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology Brought China Success, and Why They Might Lead to Its Decline. By Yasheng Huang, Ph.D. Narrated by Rebecca Lamb. Publisher's Note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. For a few days in November 2022, triggered by a deadly fire in Urumqi, Xinjiang, hundreds or thousands of protesters in Shanghai, Beijing, and other cities took to the street and university campuses to demonstrate against the government's draconian zero-COVID controls. A few in the crowd shouted, and were echoed by others, "Step down, Xi Jinping. Step down, the Communist Party." It was an incredibly brave act of defiance against a leader who had just consolidated power a month earlier at the 20th Party Congress. Some in the Western press quickly jumped on the narrative that this was potentially a game-changer for the regime. In some ways it was. Since 1989, protests in China have been scattered, localized, and issue-specific. For a protest that was nationwide in scale and had an explicit anti-regime tone, this was an extraordinary development. That said, the COVID protest is a protest, not yet at the time of this writing, a movement. The size of the protests was at the most in the thousands, compared with the millions who protested in 1989. Let's stack the size of the COVID protest against the grievance they were protesting against. Effectively an incarceration of hundreds of millions of people in their homes and in field hospitals. The lockdowns led to suicides, miscarriages, fires, starvation, and many other horrifying abominations. And yet, in a country of 1.4 billion people, just a few thousand came out to the street. The backlash is significant because it happened at all, not because of the size of its threat. To compare, at the time of China's COVID protests, millions of people in Iran demonstrated for weeks on end. Their grievance? The death of one woman in the hands of the country's morality police. It was a COVID protest, not a COVID spring, for a good reason. The Chinese state is incredibly strong. For many years, I struggled to come up with a coherent explanation for the power, reach, and discretion of the Chinese state. Certainly coercion and ideological indoctrination are at work, and probably a fair amount of societal consent as well. Also, over the past 4 decades, the strong growth of the Chinese GDP and the alleviation of poverty have earned the Chinese state a healthy amount of performative legitimacy. That has undoubtedly added some staying power to the CCP. But there has to be more. Although the previous explanations may be individually and situationally valid, they don't give us a holistic explanatory framework. Performative legitimacy may explain the reform era, but how do we explain the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution? Didn't these catastrophes generate a non-trivial dose of performative illegitimacy? And we have not mentioned the longevity of imperial China. My search for an explanation has been guided by 2 principles. One is parsimony. A variable is preferred over another one if it accommodates more of the questions or situations involved, or if it underscores those variables often proposed as causes. The other principle is proximity. That is, the closer the variable is to the explanatory vicinity of the empirical phenomenon under scrutiny, the better. This is how I arrived at the first component of the East formulation, examination. If I am to name just one difference between China and other civilizations, I would say Keju, the civil service examination first implemented during the Sui dynasty, which was in power from 581 to 618. Keju is China's blessing, but also its curse in more ways than one. I use this perspective to unlock and to make sense of the other three East components: autocracy, stability, and technology. Keju had deep penetration both cross-sectionally in society and across time and history. It was all-encompassing, laying claim to enormous investments in time and effort by a significant proportion of the Chinese population. It was an incubator of values, norms, and ideas, and so influenced the ideology and epistemology that lay at the foundation of Chinese minds. It was a state institution, designed to augment the power and the capabilities of the state. Directly, the state monopolized the very best human capital. Indirectly, the state deprived society access to talent and preempted organized religion, commerce, and intelligentsia. The Chinese state in history and today is an imprinted version of this Keju system. The Chinese state is strong because it reigns without a society. Society here means a society that is organized, has its own identity, and is considered separately legitimate from the state. Keju may not be the only cause, but it is a significant cause in decimating or preempting collective action, the essential feature of a civil society. Keju was fiercely competitive. It vaulted triumphs achieved in small and isolated examination cells, while it harshly punished collaboration, otherwise known as cheating in a Keju context. Think of the vibrantly individualistic Chinese entrepreneurs on the one hand, and their collective powerlessness vis-à-vis the CCP on the other. Think of the lockdown order in Shanghai lasting for several months. Even if a fraction of the 25 million Shanghainese acted in concert, either overtly or tacitly, in resistance, the state would be powerless no matter the size of its police force. In my mind, these are some intriguing conjectures. Others may say that they are fanciful. There may be criticisms of, for example, my broad topical coverage. East here is not geography. It is the 4 topics I explore, and I go back and forth between history and today. The book is admittedly broad and self-consciously ambitious. The usual academic format is to drill into one topic in great depth. My view is that books give us a way to tackle big topics that we are no longer able to take on in refereed journals. Very specialized and technical papers have their rightful places. But one casualty of increasing specialization in the extraordinarily high and highly varied hurdles to publication in academic journals is suboptimal supply of big ideas. Books are one of the few ways to go big. I leave it to the listeners to judge whether I have succeeded. My intention is to propose a few scaffolding ideas by which we make sense of some historical and contemporary facts and events. And there are big topics in front of us. The COVID protest is, I believe, a game changer in the sense that hundreds of millions of people shared a deeply felt experience. The tenacity of imperial regimes and of the CCP derived in no small measure an ability to compartmentalize and isolate people and preempt collective actions. Will the COVID protests presage a turning point? And what will be the long-term consequences, especially amid the rising anxiety and fear in Chinese society? At the time of this writing, some of the issues and situations are still fluid and evolving, and I may get them wrong. Or I may not have pinned down all the precise channels and mechanisms. I hope that this book may open further debates and discussions. Introduction. Unpacking the East formulation. When your scope for action is greatest, the knowledge on which you can base this action is always at a minimum. When your knowledge is greatest, the scope for action has often disappeared. Henry Kissinger, 1970. The Qin dynasty, 221 to 207 BCE, China's first dynasty, is the defining and consequential period of Chinese political development. all the imperial progenies of the Qin, as well as their republican successors, the nationalist government, and then the People's Republic of China, or PRC, carried on many of the salient features of the Qin dynasty, such as its unitary autocracy, top-down rule, impersonal nature, meritocracy, and repressiveness. The Qin dynasty gave birth to political China. There are, however, two unusual features about that dynasty. One is that for a dynasty with such a long shadow on Chinese polity, it was extraordinarily short, lasting for only 14 years, the shortest of all major dynasties. The other is that the seemingly mighty Qin, which built the Great Wall and terracotta soldiers, standardized measurements and roads, and created a national bureaucracy, was toppled by nothing more than a ragtag gang of peasants turned rebels, armed with wooden sticks. This is known as the Dazi uprising. The storyline is familiar to all school-age children in China. In 209 BCE, Chen Sheng, Wu Guang, and 900 conscripts were ordered to garrison in Yuyang, near present-day Beijing. Severe flooding delayed their journey, but under Qin law, conscripts who failed to reach their destination on time would be executed. This pushed Chen and Wu into a corner. If they were to continue, they would surely die upon arrival. If they were to rebel, they had a fighting chance to be alive. Chen and Wu rebelled. This was the first peasant rebellion in Chinese history, setting a precedent for many subsequent rebellions. Chinese history textbooks use this episode to teach students about the harshness of Qin rule. The real lessons, however, are much deeper. One lesson is about incentives. From the earlier account, one can easily see that the flaw in the poor design of Qin rule led to the unintended consequence of encouraging rebellion. But this interpretation sits uncomfortably with our knowledge about the Qin. The Qin espoused legalism, a doctrine that prized incentives above all else. The other dynasties may have made this incentive error, but probably not the Qin. A Chinese writer provides what I think is a far more convincing explanation. In his book, The Elegy of the Qin, Zhu Zhuofeng speculates that the conscript destination rule was designed for the smaller Qin kingdom, the predecessor to the Qin dynasty. The Qin kingdom unified China in 221 BCE by defeating and amalgamating 6 other kingdoms. It was small, only 1 million square kilometers, compared with the later Qin dynasty, which was 3 times as large. In the Qin kingdom, the conscript destination rule could be realistically met, but not in the larger Qin empire. Figure I.1, included in the print and ebook formats of this book, shows the Qin kingdom in the top panel and the Qin empire in the bottom panel. In terms of both the altitude and latitude dimensions, the Qin empire was more expansive than the Qin kingdom. The larger size of the Qin empire increased the heterogeneity of conditions. A small region is more homogeneous in topographical, climate, and environmental conditions. The Qin kingdom was located in the arid northwest region of China, where there were low variances in meteorological conditions. The Qin Empire encompassed far more diverse settings. Its territory stretched from the southeast to the north. Flooding might not have been a frequent occurrence in the arid North China, but it was common in southeast China. Dazixiang and Yuyang are in 2 different climate zones, and both places are situated outside of the original Qin kingdom. The decision-makers who created the time-bound rule probably had no idea about these heterogeneities on the ground, and they failed to take into account the added complexities of a larger empire. The tensions between homogeneity and heterogeneity, I also call them scale and scope, are an underlying theme in Chinese history and today. What the Dazixiang uprising shows is that you ignore the complexities of scale and scope at your own peril. The Chinese rulers have resolved these tensions, often in favor of homogeneity. In ideology, one idea, Confucianism or communism, gained at the expense of other ideas. In politics, one ruler, an emperor or a general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, dominated other centers of power. In bureaucracy, one type of human capital, Confucian mandarins or technocrats, edged out other types of human capital. As China homogenized, it also became larger. The Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 220 CE, covered an area of 6 million square kilometers. The figures are estimates and refer to the size of the dynasties at their peak. The Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907, doubled it to about 12 million square kilometers. In the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279, the size of China shrank to only 2.8 million square kilometers, but thereafter China began an expansion spree. At its height during the Yuan Dynasty, 1271 to 1368, China occupied an area of some 34 million square kilometers, much bigger than Russia at 17 million square kilometers, the largest territorial country on Earth today. The Ming 1368 to 1644 and the Qing 1644 to 1911 dynasties stood at 10 and 13 million square kilometers, respectively. The People's Republic of China, or PRC, occupies an area of 9.6 million square kilometers. For comparison, the United States spans 9.1 million square kilometers. Along with this increase in the size of its territory, China also scaled up its bureaucracy. During the Tang Dynasty, bureaucrats comprised 0.02% of the population. This figure rose to 0.06% during the Southern Song Dynasty, 1127 to 1279, and 0.18% during the Ming Dynasty. For the Qing, China's last dynasty, the available estimates are extremely varied and less reliable. The PRC took the size of the bureaucracy to another level altogether. In 1982, the number of officials was 0.08% of the population, comparable to the Song, but this is based on a narrow definition of the state. A broader definition would encompass the rank-and-file CCP members who often perform governmental functions upon instructions from the CCP. Today, the CCP stands at 96 million strong, or 6.6% of the population. The later dynasties are also very durable. The Yuan had a short lifespan, lasting only 97 years, but the Tang, 289 years, the Song, 319 years, the Ming, 275 years, and the Qing, 266 years, all enjoyed impressive longevity. The Han Dynasty is believed to have been the longest-lasting dynasty in China, lasting 414 years, and roughly comparable to the duration of the partially contemporaneous Roman Republic, 509 BCE to 27 BCE. But this comparison is debatable. The Han can be thought of as comprising two distinct dynasties, the Western Han, 206 BCE to 9 BCE, 214 years in duration, and the Eastern Han, 25 to 220, 195 years in duration. The founder of the Eastern Han, Liu Xiu, was a descendant of the imperial clan of the Western Han Dynasty, but he was not in the direct line of succession. His ancestors had been generations of landlords in the provinces. It took Liu Xiu some 10 years to vanquish 11 other claimants to the throne, a reenactment of a new dynastic creation. If we view the Western and Eastern Hans as sufficiently distinct from each other, dynastic longevity emerges later. Now, let's turn to the PRC. It will be a while before it catches up with the 319 years of the Song Dynasty, but its longevity is still impressive. Consider the following attributes of the PRC. It is one of the only 5 manifestly communist countries still remaining in the world. It has withstood catastrophic upheavals, such as the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. It has survived and even prospered from many crises that have toppled lesser regimes, such as Indonesia in 1998. Some of these crises originated from external sources. Others were on account of the culpability of the Chinese leadership. These include the 1998 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 Great Recession, the 2015 stock market crash, the 2003 SARS epidemic, the 2008 melamine scandal, and many days of air apocalypse in major Chinese cities, and the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been able to implement both economic and political shock therapies with apparent impunity. The draconian one-child policy, 1980 to 2015, the massive layoffs of as many as 30 to 50 million workers in state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, in the 1990s, the extraction of agricultural surpluses, both during the Mao era and far less well known during the 1990s, control of the spread of COVID-19, zero COVID lockdowns of multiple cities between 2020 and 2022, a massive purge of political and economic elites on charges of corruption under Xi Jinping, and the abolition of the 2-term limit for the presidency in 2018. It has survived the supposedly liberalizing effects of a growing middle class and private sector, globalization, and the rising living standard, defying the expectation that economic development would lead to democratization of the country. On October 1st, 2023, China will celebrate the 74th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, superseding the longevity of the world's first communist country, the Soviet Union. That, of course, presupposes that the CCP does not collapse before then, fulfilling the predictions of a long line of Western observers, most famously Gordon Chang. His book, The Coming Collapse of China, was published in 2001. It seems, more than 20 years on, that coming is a relative term. Chang follows venerable footsteps in misjudging the staying power of a Chinese regime. In the 1850s, Marx forecast an imminent collapse of the Qing dynasty. Instead, laboring under enormous pressures from popular rebellions and foreign invasions, the Qing muddled on for another 60 years, outliving Marx himself. Hindsight is 20/20, and world politics is complicated enough that we hesitate to judge forecasters who get it wrong. But the upending by both Imperial China and its communist successor of the forecasts of their lifespan is worth noting, because it has happened so frequently and so repeatedly. More knowledgeable China hands do not rush out predictions about the demise of China. On Imperial China, Eric Jones remarks, China's uniqueness lay in retaining an empire and a culture for an immense span of time. Political scientist Andrew Nathan noted that the authoritarian resilience of China in the aftermath of the Tiananmen crackdown, contradicting the view held by many that Tiananmen dealt a fatal blow to the legitimacy of the CCP. In the early 1990s, analysts began counting the actuarial table of Deng Xiaoping, predicting that his death would precede the death of the regime itself. Deng died in 1997. I participated in this debate and happily ended up on the correct side of history. In 1995, publishing in Foreign Policy, Why China Will Not Collapse, I argued that after the death of Deng, China would not revert to the chaos of 1976. The reasons I listed were the greater economic integration among Chinese regions as a result of economic growth and the rise of nationalism in the CCP's framing of its ruling ideology. These two observations have stood the test of history well. The PRC under Mao experienced bouts of power struggles. During the reform era, since 1978, the power struggles have waned considerably. There have been large-scale popular protests, notably the demonstrations in 1989. But by and large, these popular rebellions have been brought under control without substantial damage to the overall architecture of the Chinese state. CCP membership rose in the years following the Tiananmen crackdown, along with tax revenue, the economy, and the material welfare of Chinese citizens. Meanwhile, the political system has become noticeably more authoritarian over time. The return to a form of a personality cult and a one-man dictatorship under Xi Jinping is so far out of the norm that few China scholars saw it coming. Many, myself included, predicted persistence back in 2012. Chinese autocracy seems stickier than autocracies elsewhere. Recall the spark that lit up what eventually became the Arab Spring. The catalyst was an act of self-immolation by a Tunisian street vendor, a protest against the confiscation of his assets by a municipal official. By contrast, street vendors in China are routinely harassed, beaten, and have their assets confiscated, and China's urbanization projects have led to numerous evictions of property owners. None has fazed the CCP. The 2022 COVID protests, a potential threat, to be sure, is unlikely to derail the CCP on its own, without significant fissures within the top leadership and significant economic hardship. My book grapples with this big question of the staying power of the Chinese political system and other related questions in their historical and contemporary contexts, and puzzles abound. How has China managed to achieve a larger size and more regime durability over time? What are the tools and instruments used to achieve this outcome? Another big question relates to the rise and fall of Chinese technologies and the relationships between political and technological developments. How has the CCP, one of the world's fiercest autocracies that stifles free speech and inquiries, managed to make advances in science and technology, and in ways that eluded the Soviet Union and its own imperial former self? These advances are achieved on the back of vibrant entrepreneurship and commercial applications. They are not lonely ideas. I want to probe what holds together the CCP, a mammoth organization of 96 million members, bigger than many countries, and how the CCP empowers enough individual agency to enable growth, but not enough to generate a systemic breakdown. The last part of the book is future-oriented. I explain the path to Xi Jinping and explore the broader implication of Xi's momentous reversion to extreme autocracy. In the rest of this introduction, I will present a framework illuminated by the Dazeshang uprising. A nation often struggles between scale and scope, and successful ones get the balance between them right. I will frame the 4 topics of this book: examination, autocracy, stability, and technology, in terms of how these tensions are resolved. I conclude the introduction with an outline of the book to help a listener navigate the concepts, factual narratives, and development of ideas presented in this book. Balancing scale and scope. A large nation is both blessed and cursed. In their book, The Size of Nations, Alberto Alesina and Enrico Spolaore explain many of the tensions and trade-offs between the scale of a nation and its scope. A large scale can result in savings in the form of scale economies, but a large scope can sow discord and incoherence. The two economists recommend identifying an optimal zone between these two opposing forces to maximize the benefits of both scale and scope. Easier said than done. Let me illustrate by contrasting two historical polities, the Roman system of government and imperial China. From the founding of the Republic in 509 BCE to the deposing of the last.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?